The Bell and Silence. Northumbria year 860. Danish ships came first. At dawn without warning. 9 longships on river. Oars cutting grey water. Silent as hunting wolves. The monastery at Whitby. Sat above the cliffs. Stone walls old thin. Built for prayer not. For war not ever. Brother Cedd heard them. First before the bells. Before the shouting started. Before anything became real. He was in garden. Pulling winter turnips up. Cold ground, cold hands. Breath misting in dark. And he heard it. The particular silence that falls before violent things. Happen the way birds stop before the storm. Not storm itself but absence of everything normal. That tells you something is coming, something large. He did not run. Cedd never ran anywhere. He was 53 years old and thin. Thin as candle flame. Thin as old vellum. Thin as patience worn to its final layer. He stood in garden, with turnip in hand, and listened to silence, and understood what it contained and what it meant for everyone inside those thin stone walls. The abbot was Aldred, fat man, good man, who had built library, over 30 patient years, one manuscript at time, some bought, some copied, some carried hereby, monks from distant places, places that existed now, only in those pages. Aldred cared about books, the way other men care about gold, land, children, legacy, anything permanent. He believed words outlasted everything else, outlasted stone, outlasted bone, outlasted memory itself if written down carefully on good vellum, in steady careful hand. Cedd went to him, immediately found him already, awake already at window, looking at river below, where longships were landing, men jumping into shallows, weapons catching grey light. How many? Cedd asked. Too many, Aldred said, simply without looking away. His voice was calm, the particular calm of man who has already moved through fear and come out other side, into something quieter, something that is not peace, but resembles it enough. The other brothers were waking now, sounds of movement, prayers, interrupted feet on stone floors, voices asking questions nobody answered, because nobody knew answers, yet only questions existed. At this particular moment, we must hide them, Aldred said, still watching. River, the books, Cedd understood immediately, not themselves, not the silver plate, not the gold cross, above altar, not anything else, only the books, because Aldred was Aldred, and had always been, exactly this way, always, would be until end. How long do we have? Cedd asked Aldred. Watched the men below, assembling on riverbank, counting their numbers, their purpose, their particular kind of organized violence that Vikings brought with them always, wherever they landed then. 1 hour, perhaps less. Go now, take brothers, you trust, take everything that can be carried, what cannot be carried, hide below in the old cellar under stone, the one nobody knows. Go. Cedd went then. He moved through monastery, with the quiet urgency of man who understands that noise costs time, and time is only thing they have left. He found brother Oswin, first young man 19, strong back, good hands, fast learner, slower talker, which was exactly right for this particular morning. Then brother Tatwine, who was old as Cedd, but moved faster always, had moved faster always, would until he could not. Then Tatwine would simply stop like clock. Unwound they gathered books, armfuls of them, careful, even in their haste, because damaged vellum was worse than no vellum at all. Aldred had taught them that years ago, and the lesson had stayed permanent, the way real lessons do, not the ones you memorize but ones you understand in bone. The cellar was beneath, the kitchen floor stone, trapdoor hidden under rushes, cold and darkened, smelling of old earth, and something else, something older than the monastery itself. Perhaps the place had been something before Christianity came, something that remembered older gods differently. They lowered the books carefully, one by one, Oswin climbing down first, receiving them from above, Tatwine passing them down with hands that shook slightly, not from fear, from age, which was different thing though it looked same from outside. Cedd counted as they went 12 manuscripts down, then 20, then 30. The Lindisfarne Gospels were not here, thank God. They were safe already, further north, but there were other things here, things that existed nowhere else in entire world. A history of Northumbria, written by brother now dead, 40 years gone. a collection of prayers, in language so old, even priests could not read it any more. Only Aldred could read it, and only barely then, a bestiary with drawings, of creatures real and imagined drawn by hand, of someone who had never seen lion, elephant, whale, but had imagined them from descriptions alone, and made them somehow more true than real. The drawings had the quality of things deeply believed rather than merely observed, which was its own kind of truth, perhaps the better kind. They heard the gates, then the sound of wood under assault, systematic, methodical, the Viking way, not passionate violence but professional violence, which was considerably more frightening because it had patience behind it, and patience always wins against everything else, except more patience. Then Cedd made decision. Then he had not planned to make this decision. It arrived fully formed, the way real decisions sometimes do not, built slowly from reasoning but appearing complete from nowhere, like something that was always there waiting to be noticed. He told Oswin and Tatwine to stay below, to stay silent whatever they heard, whatever happened above them, to stay silent and still as the stones around them until silence returned, complete silence, the kind that means danger has passed, not paused. Oswin looked at him with young man eyes that understood what Cedd was doing and did not want him to do it, but also understood that wanting changes nothing when a man has decided a thing. Tatwine simply nodded, the nod of old man who has seen enough of the world to know that some people walk toward things while others walk away, and both are necessary and neither is wrong exactly, just different, and the world needs both kinds. Cedd pulled trapdoor shut above them, replaced the rushes, stood in kitchen for moment listening to his own breathing, steady it deliberately the way his teacher had shown him 40 years ago. Old monk called Bede, not the famous Bede, different Bede, smaller, quieter, but wise in ways that famous people rarely manage to be wise. Breath is the beginning, that Bede had said, of everything else you will ever need to do. Steady the breath, and you steady the man, steady the man, and you steady the moment, steady the moment, and you have enough. Cedd walked out then, into the courtyard where Aldred stood, already facing the gate, which was splintering now, letting through light in thin lines, like the monastery itself was becoming lantern. The other brothers were there, some praying, some simply standing the way people stand when they have run out of things to do and must simply be present for whatever comes, which is its own kind of courage, perhaps the purest kind, requiring nothing except willingness to remain. The gate came down then, not dramatically, not like stories tell it with single great crash, but in pieces, gradually giving way the way things give way when force is patient and persistent, and has nowhere else to be. The Vikings came through in order, not chaotically, which again was the frightening thing about them. They were organized, they had done this before many times, before in many places, and they knew how it worked and what came where and in what sequence. Their leader was tall man, red hair, worn long beard, same color reaching chest. He wore no helmet now, which meant he felt no threat here, which was accurate, and also told Cedd something about how this man assessed situations quickly, correctly, confidently, the mark of someone who has survived long enough to trust his own judgment completely. The tall man looked at Aldred, then at Cedd, then around courtyard, at the monastery itself, its walls, its windows, its bell tower where bell still hung unmoved. Where is your gold? The tall man asked, in accented but clear English, which meant he had done this before, in English places before, and learned the words that mattered most first. Aldred stepped forward then. Cedd had expected this. Aldred was abbot, and abbots stepped forward. That was what abbots did. We have little gold, Aldred said. The silver plate in the chapel, 2 candlesticks and cross. Above altar, you are welcome to those things. They are metal only, they can be replaced. The tall man looked at him with expression that was not unkind exactly, but was entirely without sentiment, the expression of man who deals in realities, not feelings. And I said gold. Aldred nodded. The cross has some gold on it, very little, mostly silver. The tall man considered this briefly, then nodded to his men. 2 of them went Toward chapel Cedd watched them go and felt nothing about the cross, or candlesticks or silver plate. They were objects, and objects were objects, and the books were below, and the books were not objects. They were something else, something that did not have a word exactly, but that Cedd had spent his whole life understanding, without being able to name completely. What do you read? The tall man asked then, surprising Cedd entirely. The question came from nowhere, seemed to come from genuine curiosity, which was not what Cedd had expected from a man who had just broken down his gate on grey November morning. Pardon me, Cedd said. The tall man pointed at Cedd, hands the ink stains that never fully washed out the permanent marks of a man who copied manuscripts for living. You write, he said. I read and write. Yes, Cedd said. The tall man nodded slowly, in the way of man filling in picture he has been building for some time. We have stories, he said. Then my people have many stories, but they live here. He touched his own head only. Here when I die, they die with me. Cedd looked at him for a long moment. The November light was cold and clear, the kind of light that shows everything exactly as it is, without flattery, without softening, and in that light the tall man looked less like destroyer and more like something else, something Cedd did not quite have word for then, either a keeper, perhaps a carrier of things that had no other way to survive except inside people, which was the most fragile possible vessel for anything that mattered. You want them written down, Cedd said. The tall man looked at him steadily. My father told me stories. His father told him I have 3 sons. They want silver, not stories, and when my sons die, the stories die too. And that is wrong. It is wrong, and I know it wrong, and I do not know what to do about it except this. Cedd understood then completely, and suddenly, the way understanding sometimes comes, not gradually but altogether at once, like light through opened door. This man had not come here only for gold, or perhaps he had come for gold first and found something else, or perhaps both things were true simultaneously, which was how most true things work, not one thing or another, but both things at once. And the difficulty was holding both without letting go of either. Aldred was watching Cedd now with expression of man who sees where something is going and is not certain whether to be relieved or afraid, and has settled on being both simultaneously. If I write your stories, Cedd said carefully, what happens to this place, to these brothers? The tall man was quiet moment. The length of real consideration, not performance of consideration. My men take the gold, he said, and we leave. You stand, your monastery stands, your brothers stand. I have what I came for, plus something I did not know I needed until now, which is better than what I planned. Cedd looked at Aldred. Aldred looked at Cedd. The look contained entire conversation, conducted in silence, in the way that people who have known each other long enough can conduct entire conversations without words spoken. The look said, this is not what we expected, and also this is perhaps the only way through, and also are you certain, and also I trust you, and also God works in ways that make no sense until afterward, when you look back and see the shape of it. Cedd turned back to tall man. My name is Cedd, he said. I am Halfdan. Cedd, tall man, son of Ragnar of the western fjords. Then they sat together in the cold courtyard on stone bench, while Halfdan men moved through monastery, taking silver, taking gold, taking anything metal of value, and Halfdan talked and Cedd listened with the complete attention of man who knows that listening is itself a form of writing, that what enters ears carefully enough leaves through hand faithfully enough, if the space between is clean and quiet and honest. Halfdan told him about his father, Ragnar, who had been greatest sailor of generation, who had navigated by stars alone across open ocean to places that had no names yet in any language he knew. He told him about his mother Sigrid, who had ruled their settlement for 3 winters, while Ragnar was away, and had done it better than Ragnar had ever done it, which Ragnar acknowledged freely, because Ragnar had been that kind of man, the kind secure enough to recognize greatness in others without feeling diminished by it. He told him about the gods then, Odin and Thor and Freya, and the great tree Yggdrasil whose roots reached into every world, simultaneously, and whose branches held everything that existed, and everything that would exist, and everything that had existed, and how the squirrel ran up and down carrying messages, between the eagle at top and the serpent at bottom, and how the whole universe was a conversation between things that could not directly speak to each other. Cedd listened to all of it, and his hand moved across vellum he had brought out, quietly without comment, and the ink was cold, and his fingers were cold, but the words came out steady and clear and true, the way cold sometimes makes things clearer rather than harder, because discomfort focuses attention in ways that comfort never manages to. They worked until noon, Halfdan talking, Cedd writing, the monastery quiet around them, brothers staying in their cells by instruction from Aldred, who understood that the fewer people present the simpler everything remained. Then Halfdan stopped mid-sentence and looked at what Cedd had written. He could not read it, of course. Latin script was not his, but he looked at it the way people look at music, written down when they cannot read music but recognize that the marks mean something real, that there is sound inside them waiting to be released by someone who knows how to open it. Is it right? Halfdan asked, meaning his stories, meaning his father, meaning his mother, meaning everything he had trusted this stranger with this morning on evidence of ink-stained hands alone. It is right, Cedd as right as I can make it. Halfdan nodded once, then stood the signal to his men who gathered at gate with their taken things, their silver, the gold, their ordinary harvest from ordinary raid, except this one had produced something extra, something that did not weigh anything and could not be spent and would not rust and could not be stolen, because it was already given freely, which is only way anything real is ever truly given. Then Halfdan paused at gate, turned back to Cedd. One more thing, he said, my name in your book makes certain my name is in your book, Halfdan of the Western Fjords, son of Ragnar. Let it be there when I am gone, when my sons are gone, when everyone who knew me is gone. Let it be there in that place where things do not die. Cedd looked at the page, found space at top, wrote the name carefully in his steadiest hand, Halfdan, son of Ragnar of Western Fjords, who came to Whitby in year 860 and spoke of his father and his gods and his world, and trusted a monk with all of it, which was either foolish or brave, and is perhaps the same thing. Halfdan read none of this, but looked at his name written down, and something in his face settled the way faces settle when something long carried is finally put down somewhere safe. Then he walked through gate and was gone. The longships left by afternoon, river running grey and empty again, as though nothing happened, as though morning was ordinary, which it was not and never would be again. Cedd went to kitchen, floor lifted, rushes opened, trapdoor called down to Oswin and Tatwine, who climbed out, blinking into the pale afternoon light like men emerging from underwater, which perhaps they had been. Oswin looked around, courtyard at gate, broken on ground, at absence of danger, at Cedd standing there alive and intact. What happened? Oswin asked. Cedd thought about how to answer this accurately. A man came, he said, who needed something only we could give, and gave us something only he could give, and we both left with more than we arrived with, which is the best possible outcome for any encounter between any two people anywhere. Oswin looked at him the way young people look at old ones when the explanation explains nothing, but somehow explains everything simultaneously. Tatwine simply nodded again, the nod of man who expected something like this, because Tatwine had lived long enough to expect that the world would surprise him, which itself had stopped surprising him. Then Aldred came out, then looked at Cedd, looked at missing silver, looked at broken gate, looked at page in Cedd hand with the careful handwriting and the Norse name at top, and said nothing for long moment. Then said only, the library is intact. Yes, Cedd, and one new manuscript added. Aldred looked at page, read what Cedd had written about Halfdan and his father and his gods and his world, and his mother Sigrid, who ruled better than Ragnar, and which Ragnar acknowledged freely, because Ragnar was that kind of man. Read it all carefully with the attention he gave everything written down, which was total and complete and final. Then he looked up at Cedd and said, this is good work. which from Aldred was, everything which from Aldred, was the highest thing, that could be said, about anything in the world. Cedd took the page back to scriptorium, sat at his desk, in the thin winter light and continued writing, everything Halfdan had said, everything he had told him about Ragnar and Sigrid and Odin and Yggdrasil and the squirrel, carrying messages between worlds. He wrote it all, because Halfdan had been right about one thing, completely and without question. It was wrong for stories to die when the people who carried them died. It was simply wrong, and if Cedd could do anything about it, then doing it was not choice, it was obligation, plain as cold, plain as hunger, plain as the particular grey November light coming through scriptorium window, falling across vellum, across ink, across the careful, steady marks that meant things that lasted longer than the people who made them, longer than the buildings that held them, longer than the roads that led to them, longer than almost anything except the stories themselves, which went on and on into the dark ahead, like road that has no visible end, but which you walk anyway, because the walking itself is the point, always has been, always will be, as long as there are people who understand that some things are worth carrying forward into whatever comes next, regardless of the cost, regardless of the dark, regardless of anything at all that tries to stop them from arriving.